programming, and there are lots of flavors that are all around that stuff. For the purposes of the discussion, I'm going to work on the assumption that they're all synonymous. People argue about the details, about what this is or that is, but to all intents and purposes, I'll treat them as one and the same. Basically, the idea is, behind all of this, is that you create something which behaves vaguely like Darwinian evolution, except we're dealing with things which are not biological organisms. So the idea is that we create a non-biological organism, for whatever that means, that is able to evolve, to mutate, to reproduce, and to become closer to what we want it to be by a process that is analogous to natural selection. So that's the key part of this, the natural selection bit. Now, we know with Darwinian evolution that it's survival of the fittest. And for biology, that's nice and easy to actually identify. We simply say, if you survive long enough to reproduce, you're probably fit enough for the purpose that you were created for. Whether or not your offspring survive, or whether or not you survive to produce another generation, is entirely a different matter. But for the purposes of discussion, sort of fit for purpose or natural selective selection, the idea is you survive long enough to reproduce, and hopefully you're young, even better adapted at reproducing. With evolutionary algorithms, what we're trying to do is say, we want to give a problem to a digital organism. So we want to specify some problem. We have to keep it constrained. We can't be as big as biology. We have to keep it constrained. So we identify a problem that we want solved. That's hard because we've got to find a way of representing the problem. That's the first big challenge. The second big challenge is to be able to say, what does fit for purpose mean? So when we do our natural selection, how are we measuring how successful an organism is at actually being successful at what it wants to try and do? So you've got two very hard things to do. So for the purposes of the discussion, what we're going to do is we're going to say the task of our evolutionary algorithm is to produce a set of prime numbers. Nice and simple, we can define the problem. And if it's a digital organism, number crunching is sort of second nature to it, so we can actually do things that are interesting with numbers and get a result out. If we're sort of like saying face recognition or being able to run a maze or whatever, these are a bit more intractable in terms of defining the problem and defining fit for purpose. So in the case of our evolutionary algorithm, which is going to solve prime numbers, or not solve them, but identify what they are by some mechanism, the fit for purpose is how close did our algorithm get to producing the right sequence of numbers. Obviously, the more numbers it gets right, the better this algorithm is. That's not to say it's perfect. It might fall off the edge at some point, but in order to measure this organism against that organism, what we want to do is be able to quantify success or failure. So it's a relatively simple fitness algorithm. So the biggest challenges in coming up with evolutionary algorithms is defining the problem and defining the fitness criteria. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is you've got to come up with some sort of basic algorithm, which is normally something that you construct yourself. And you say, okay, this doesn't do what I want, but it's a starting point. And so you generate a random selection, which is going to be your initial population. So that's where you're going to start off. So you decide how many are going to be in the population. There are more complicated forms of that, but for the moment we'll assume it's a single population. You decide how many members there are, and you liberally sprinkle variations of your initial algorithm in that population. Now, probably most of those algorithms are not going to be very good. They're not going to achieve what we want. So? Sorry,
just for clarification's sake, when you talk about liberally sprinkling variations of your initial algorithm, the initial algorithm is, as you say, probably handcrafted, or those variations handcrafted?
You've got the choice, really. You could start with an algorithm which you handcrafted and then apply a series of mutations to that. or you could apply some algorithm which is going to modify it in some deterministic way, that's such that you are exploring various possibilities that it could solve. But the seeding is entirely up to you as the researcher.
The point I'm making, because we're going to do this iteratively.
Yeah.
I know I'm jumping ahead, but
Yeah.
because we're going to do this iteratively, part of the key, my understanding of genetic algorithms is that part of the key is that these mutations, these variations, they themselves are algorithmically generated, whether that's using sheer randomness and entropy, much the way that Mother Nature shuffles genetics, or whether it's applying an algorithm that will make, as you say, deterministic variations to the underlying organism is obviously up to you. But the key here is that these variations, they themselves are generated. They're not you writing 50 variations to create your initial population.
I think the key word here is kick-starting the progress, the whole process. That's multiple words, but the key idea here
Concept.
is because if you're going to simply say, I'm going to randomly generate in organisms, you could randomly generate in non-viable organisms, which means they won't reproduce. That's the end of your experiment. So you want to make sure at least your first population has some viability, some capability, some small chance that they may reproduce. Does that sort of answer?
Does everybody else here understand what?
So you start with multiple options that have a standing chance, basically, instead of one and then mutating that. You're increasing your chance of getting...
But there's still mutations of your original algorithm, right?
Oh, generation one, I would say, well, you want to have at least some chance that you're going to get to generation two.
Yeah.
So that means even if you only handcraft one, you've got some chance of getting to generation two. If it's entirely random, probability would suggest that you're going to have something non-viable. And that might be the end of your experiment on iteration one.
Well, depending on how you've structured the experiment, I've certainly seen experiments with evolutionary genetic algorithms where it takes 100 or 200 generations before you get, purely random, before you get a generation that's capable of reproducing. Which also arguably matches what Mother Nature did with genetics.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But in biological evolution, we had to wait a while. So this is a short-circuiting exercise by saying, I'm going to seed it with some cheats, and then I'm going to take my cheats and then let them get on with it. Yeah, I suppose as a purist, we should simply say, let's just put a load of chemicals in a pot, stir it up, zap it with lightning, and see what happens.
It depends on the problem space too, right? I mean, if, and the example I sent around this afternoon, what was being generated was a configuration file for a field programmable gate array that was a fixed byte size. So there were only so many random variations, and they knew that some of them would work. So they didn't, in that case, they were perfectly happy to just sort of populate it with random data and continue populating it with random data until they got one that worked, and then mutate from there. But it really depends on the problem space, I should imagine.
Yeah, I'm coming to something which is a bit more complicated, which does address that, funnily enough. So we've got our initial population by whatever means, and what we're going to do is we're basically just going to stir it up and see what happens. So there are certain key things that need to happen. First of all is you need to have your initial population, and you define what your population size is going to be. And normally from generation to generation, you maintain the same size population. There's no strict rule as to why that should be, but generally you do, because there are other rules that we can apply if we have a fixed size population. So there are various ways by which we can move forward from there. First of all, you need to choose a subset of the population that is going to reproduce. So you don't just like say everybody gets at it, turn it into a Roman orgy. Basically you say you and you and you and you and you. Whether you decide you're going to do matchmaking is entirely up to yourself, but normally you simply use some selection algorithm to determine who are the parents of the next generation. The gut instinct of most people is say, let's apply the fitness algorithm and simply say we will choose whatever's at the top of the stack. This would be a mistake because of the concept of local maxima. You don't know whether or not something which is less well suited for the problem that comes out with a lower score might actually lead to a better result. So you don't always want to choose the top N as being your reproductive group. So that's your first question you've got to ask. Who are we going to allow to interact? The next one is, how do they go about the interaction? That's called recombination. So you take 2, 3, 4, for a simple algorithm you simply take 2, but you can make it more complex. 2 parents, bring them together and apply some recombination algorithm. The normal one is simple crossover or multiple crossover. Crossover is nice and simple. You've got 2 genetics, sort of genes, sets of genes, algorithm, units, whatever they are, and then you simply say the new child is going to be this half of this one, and it's going to be this half of this one, and then what's left becomes the child. So that's simple crossover. You can have more complex crossover where you chop it into multiple slices and then you do the same transposition. The idea being that you're getting a mixture of genes coming in, some from each of the parents involved, and hopefully what you're going to get out of that is, first of all, a viable descendants, and secondly, hopefully, one that's better adapted or scores higher in the fitness test. So that's the cunning plan, but of course that doesn't necessarily work. The next thing that you can apply, and this is the important bit, which is where the Darwinian bit comes in, and that is the deliberate introduction of error in the copying. Now that, you don't want to mix it up too much by doing combination and mutation on every offspring, simply because the mutation and the combination, if there's too much of that, you will end up with non-viables. So you need to make sure whatever changes you're doing have a reasonable likelihood of generating another generation that can actually reproduce and is fitter for purpose. So basically the idea is you go round and round this circle, organisms that don't have mitochondria, that basically they're just very simple organisms. So a lot of the research that was done in the mid-80s and the early 90s, notably, if you want to look it up, Dr. Thomas Ray of the University of Delaware, he went on to the University of Tokyo. I think he's now with the University of Oklahoma, who came up with the Tierra project, which is probably familiar, maybe, or not. The Tierra project was basically a prokaryotic evolutionary algorithm project. You can download the entire project if you go looking for this guy on the internet. I think it's up to version 6 or something at the moment, and you can actually run these genetic algorithms, watch them evolve, and these prokaryotic organisms can exhibit some very interesting biological behaviour, like symbiosis, like parasitism, a variety of things that we normally associate with biological organisms. But the current research is now in eukaryotes, so we're looking at multi-cell organisms. So the idea being that you have several of these evolutionary algorithms that are in some way being symbiotic and cooperating and producing a more viable, a more fit-for-purpose result because of their combinations rather than simply mutations of generation to generation. Now, the way by which this came around is because of this idea of population. Originally, population was one big population. You chucked it in a pot, you stirred it up, you gave them a zap of electricity, as we discussed, and then eventually you get a new generation and you keep going. But the idea was to say what would happen if we had different pools of populations that evolved separately, and then periodically you crossed over things across the population pools. And there are various models for that. You can have groups, you can have local, you can have global, etc. But the idea is that you get this cross-pollination across populations. And out of that came the interesting idea of eukaryotic evolutionary algorithms. So one thing that I'm working on at the moment is the concept that you have small pieces of code that know how to do very, very little things. And they are effectively the genes of an evolutionary algorithm. The idea being that you join them together, they've got the ability to replicate themselves, so they know where their beginning is, they know where their end is, and they've got a very simple algorithm which basically says I copy myself somewhere else, and that's all it does. Then what happens is that in that copying process, errors are introduced. Also, if there are other algorithms that are within a certain space, whatever space means, however we define space, then you can end up with recombination effects with that as well. So the idea there is that you've actually got something which is a program. It's lots of small pieces of program which actually run as bytecode. Now this is where the interesting stuff happens, because of course then you can start having specialization within a genetic algorithm. So parts of the code can be specialized at certain things. What that means is, obviously in the problem space, we don't know what specialization means. Is it good at reproduction? Is it good at counting? Is it good at arriving at our prime number list? So we've moved from a very simple situation where we have a series of bytes that may be rubbish, that may actually do something, that produce a result, to something which is repeating itself and replicating itself, rather than an external thing doing the replication. So that, in a nutshell, is evolutionary algorithms.
One quick question. Could you fill us in? Obviously, there's a lot of research being done in this space. And one of the things that's interesting about this space is that it's being used to solve problems that, or to try to attempt to solve problems that are otherwise believed to be relatively intractable. So could you give us some examples of some of those problem spaces where this approach has proved to be more useful than some of the more traditional computer science approaches?
The obvious one that I think is oft quoted, although it uses prokaryotic rather than eukaryotic techniques, is determining for a chemical molecule exactly what the orientation of a molecule would be. So what happens is that you give it a load of data, and then by whatever magic the inventors of this algorithm came up with, I'm not a chemist, it can eventually figure out what the orientation would be of each molecule within a compound. Now the problem there is, of course, that's exponential. The number of bits of this molecule becomes an exponential problem. But with the evolutionary algorithms, because they're operating in parallel, they're trying lots of different things, and the fitness for purpose, God knows what the fitness for purpose algorithm is, but presumably they've got one of these. They can eventually arrive at a configuration for a molecule that is likely based on evolutionary algorithms. And as they approach what they consider to be the error delta diminishing to a threshold.
And that doesn't require exponential time?
Because these things are happening in parallel and there's the element of chance, there's no guarantee with evolutionary algorithms you will arrive at a solution.
Sure. But we can't say that if we arrive at a solution, we will arrive at a solution within a time frame which can be bound.
I'm sure that there is a big O number for that particular application, but I don't know what the big O number is. But I would imagine it would be less, simply because of parallelism and statistical probability of one of the algorithms with enough of them arriving at the solution. So I guess it's a probability statistical question rather than an evolutionary algorithm one.
Cool. The other space I've seen this used in bits and pieces is in machine learning, where you can find a plane where you know the correct answers lie. You can only get it down to a two-dimensional plane. And then you can use genetic algorithms to, over time, tune your understanding so you can get it down to a segment of a plane or a conic section of a plane, or, and slowly reduce the problem space so that over time the machine can learn more optimal solutions.
This is where I was coming to in an earlier part of this, when I was talking about local maxima and local minima. Because if you're looking for a solution, suppose that you are trying to find the highest place in a mountain range, and the only piece of information is that if you're standing at the top of the hill and all points lead downwards, then I must have reached the highest point in the mountain range. all you've managed to demonstrate is you've found the highest point from where you happen to be standing to start with. But that doesn't solve the problem of what's the highest point. And this has applications all over computer science, trying to find the non-local maxima or the non-local minima for that point. So the idea being that because you've got all of these algorithms, so what you're imagining here is that each of these algorithms is starting at a different point in the field, in the mountain range. And so they're all climbing up mountains and making their own decisions about what is, for them, the top of the mountain. Now, of course, our fitness algorithm is seeing which one's number is biggest. And then gradually over time, hopefully, and there's no guarantee because evolutionary algorithms are by their definition random, hopefully one of them will actually be sitting at the top of the real highest mountain. Did that deal with it?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Okay.
Anybody else have any other questions? Well, thanks a lot, Rick. It's really interesting. And we should think about who wants to do it next week. The people who've already done it are exempt until everyone's done it. So